and so that we know where we're going. Because as the old African proverb says, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. So let me just get started with the thing. In the 70s, I'm going to try to be real general, not date specific as such, but in the 70s we see the rise of another kind of black student movement, which is campus-centered. For the first time, African students are integrated into white universities, and they come smack up against academic white supremacy. And so we see a rise of the black student movement, and that black student movement is immediately tied to the local community, if there is a local black community where the college is. And that does something very particular in relationship to our support movement in terms of the African liberation support movement. We see a rise also of young people supporting an international cause in the 1970s, and eventually the formation of the African Liberation Support Committee, primarily by young people. Those of us who are still alive today were young then, who were active then, in our 20s, and in some cases teenagers in that movement. Also at the same time, because of the presence of black students on these campuses, we see a black studies movement forming. And that black studies movement was an activist-centered, community-centered movement at the time. Of course, over time, over the decades, the black studies movements that survive white supremacy on campuses, for the most part, wind up trying to aspire to be like Skip Gates. And Skip Gates is trying to aspire to be like Bill Gates. Okay? So it moves from a center of activism to a center of entrepreneurship in the worst bourgeois sense. We also see the inspiration in this period of our movement by the victories of the African liberation movement. The victories that have occurred in the 1970s in the African liberation movements have inspired many of our struggles, our movement here in the United States. We also see a key turning point in this is 1976, June 16th, the Soweto uprising in South Africa, where you have a major shift in the liberation movement in South Africa by the grassroots, by the young people out of the grassroots movement, shifting from moral suasion, negotiation kind of thing to more of a dynamic force coming out of the grassroots. That's an inspiration to the African liberation struggle right here in this country. We also keep in mind that all during this period and all during the periods that we have just talked about, the 50s and 60s, the reparations movement is developing, is growing, being discussed at many different levels. It hasn't reached its grassroots levels as we are beginning to see now in the 21st century, but it's something that is informing the movement. We also see black workers developing as a very powerful force. The black working class is beginning to see itself in major urban centers and major industries as a very powerful force. And that is happening because those industries are now beginning to be forced to move black people up into positions where they never were before, either on the production floor or within management, and they are thinking and looking at ways of moving the industry out of the United States. And so brothers and sisters who are in those industries are very aware of what is going on in terms of the dynamic motion of capitalism. And so we see a rise of the Detroit revolutionary workers' movements of various kinds. And the Black Workers' Congress comes up in this period. The Detroit Revolutionary Union movement grows and spreads across the country. We also see black workers in the South beginning to get organized and struggle for union recognition and so on in this period. Very, very interesting when you look at some of the individuals who are in the leadership coming out of the democratic, social civil rights movement, and moving into those leaders, those individuals moving into the labor movement in the South. Teresa El Amin talks about this in terms of the timeline, looking at that. I would also recommend at this point that we look at two books. One is by Brother Rod Bush, called We Are Not What We Seem, that traces the nationalist movement from the 20th century on to the present. Very, very important piece of work to really help us sum up this whole dynamic. And the other one is, title I've forgotten, but maybe people on the panel and the audience may remember, is Kamosi Woodard's most recent work also on the Congress of African Peoples movement and Amiri Baraka in the 70s and so forth. I don't know why I forgot the title of that book. Nation Within a Nation, there you go. Nation Within a Nation. Another very, very important work to help us sum up the struggles. Another dynamic that was happening in this period that has impacted the Black Liberation Movement is the formation of African American women as sisters, as feminists or womenists. And one of those formations that came out in 1972-73 was the Third World Women's Alliance here in New York City. And those sisters did not see themselves as separate anti-male organizations. They saw themselves as coming together to deal with male chauvinist issues, as well as issues that women face, black women and women of color face in terms of white supremacy. And they pulled together a very influential organization, the Third World Women's Alliance. And in this period, also in the 70s as well as in the 60s, on that note, we see that the Black Liberation Movement informs the white movement. We have the creation of the women's movement that was directly inspired by the Black Liberation Movement civil rights work. We see the creation of the Students for Democratic Society as a spin-off of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee directly. We see the anti-war movement becoming pro-Vietnam liberation movement oriented by the revolutionary content that African Americans present in the quote-unquote anti-war movement of the 70s. I remember particularly battling with the Socialist Worker Party around a demonstration that we wanted out of Harlem to go to join the massive demonstration that was happening in the 1973-74, I think it was, 72, I mean, at the United Nations. And they were advocating that we be supportive of the anti-war peace effort, and we were supporting the Vietnam liberation movement. And that's why we were marching, and we were marching out of Harlem to inform our people. And there was this tension there. But over that period, we see the dynamics moving in the left more towards supporting the anti-imperialist causes in Vietnam. We also begin to see in the 1970s various alphabets, as I call them, radical revolutionary alphabets being formed. These pre-party formations, party formations, mainly inspired by many of the new white left, and they're trying to attract some of the black folk. And so some of us get caught up in that and wind up, for example, creating the destruction of the African Liberation Support Committee at a critical time, a very critical time in the support movement on the African continent. And this, when we look in hindsight and look back and talk to people, this is not only an internal error of our, how would you say, petty bourgeois behavior, but also work on by COINTELPRO. Okay, there were incidences where there were people at critical meetings that destroyed a certain dynamic in the organization, and we see the overall destruction of the African Liberation Support Committee by 1976, early 1976 is really finished as a black support effort for the African Liberation Movement. And this is at a time when the MPLA, for example, needed the support from our forces, and there were all kinds of destructive things happening then. And when we look back at it, we see that the most dynamic negative force in that was the works of the COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program in this. We see the formation, as Brother Ron suggested, the National Black Assembly and Gary, and later on the formation of this organization, and in between the National Black Political, Independent Political Party formations. We see the All-African People's Revolutionary Party coming into being, the African People's Party, all these efforts to, various efforts to bring together progressive forces in the black community, revolutionary forces in the black community for the sake of revolutionary change and struggle. Now, there were other formations that were happening on the ground, and those formations, for example, like the Black Panther Party, became the principal target, and also the Nation of Islam at that point in the early 70s, became the principal target of COINTELPRO operations. And we find many of our activists, warriors, sisters and brothers being bumped off by various forces, literally bumped off in this period. And that becomes a particular kind of dynamic in the 1970s, where many of our people were relegated, as the CIA says and the FBI says, neutralized. And the neutralization is not only killing, and bumping off is not only killing, but driving people crazy, driving people out of the country, bribing people on various things. And so we see a new dynamic happening, a new, more complex dynamic happening within the Black Liberation Movement, and that is the ability of an aspect of the movement to be used against the more genuine forces of the movement. And we still have that with us today, but to a lesser extent. We also have to remember two other things. The Attica Rebellion, major turning point in the development of the prison industrial complex, because there were two responses to the Attica Rebellion. One was to concede certain demands that the brothers had in Attica, and the other was, another aspect of the ruling class, was to find ways to incorporate that movement, that dynamic of prisons into the industrial complex. And that part we see today as an essential tool, because they knew at that time in 1971 that the way capitalism was developing and on an international scale and leaving this country, there'll be a rise of unemployment, and particularly among people of color, and they needed to find an institutional dynamic to confine us and use us in other ways. And so they put into place, after the Attica Rebellion, this apparatus to create what we see today, this maddening prison industrial complex. The other thing that happened at the same time and connected, and I'll stop here, is the rise of black mayors of dying cities. And many of us supported many of these black mayors in the beginning, in Gary, Indiana, Newark, New Jersey, Philadelphia, and so forth. There were all these different campaigns in Philadelphia, conferences that were going on, conventions and what have you. We supported them. Many of us felt that if there was a black mayor who supported some of our ideas in office, that there would be a major change and shift in our urban centers. But as we see today, it didn't happen positively. And I will say that the relationship between the development of the prison industrial complex and the underdevelopment of the urban centers where we live is a direct relationship. We also see in this period, lastly, the rise of black exploitation films, creating a cultural foundation for capitalism to use and abuse black culture and to keep our youth strung out over nonsense. And that was crude, and we laughed at it in the 70s. But that was a relentless effort by the cultural apparatus of the capitalist forces. And today we see it as a key dynamic in diverting and just deteriorating the minds of our young people. Very hard for us now, not impossible, but very hard for us now to get in touch with our young people because of this dynamic. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. The next speaker will cover the period from 1980 to 1990. And this is certainly, when I spoke to him, he said it was impossible. So he's going to take a layer of the, he's one of the founding members of the organization, so he's going to take some founding members of, I guess, liberties, and sort of cover a period from 1968 to the present, and which would definitely overlap his involvement in this organization. The next speaker would be our very own from California, Obati Shaka, PhD. Let me tell you a little bit about our dear Dr. Shaka. For 40 years, he's been in the Black movement. He's an activist scholar, chairs the San Francisco Core from 1963 to 1965, and he led the largest Northern Civil Rights movement. He chaired the political committee for the 6th Pan-African Congress in Tanzania. He's a national vice chair for organizing and training in NBUF. He's the author of Political Legacy of Malcolm X, Art and Leadership, Volume 1 and 2, and Return to African Mother Principle of male and female equality, our very own Obati Shaka.
Hotel. How you all doing? This is amazing that people could cover this much ground in such a short period of time. Truly amazing. You should give them all a hand. Just briefly to deal with 80 to 90 in very brief statement. The end of the 70s represented a lull in the Black liberation movement caused by the counterintelligence program and attack against many of our militant groups. And so between around 1976 and 1979, there was a real lull. In 1980, we see the breaking out of that lull with the formation of the National Black United Front and the National Black Independent Political Party. By 1984, we see the emergence of an African-centered cultural renaissance launched by our scholars. And that's something that's carried through today. So much for the sequential analysis, which I'm a child of Obatala, and Obatala is sequential. But today I thought we need to do something, at least on my part, that's not sequential. I want to focus on two things. The impact of the African independence movement on Africa today, and what I call the choice between two cultures that has occurred since 1968 in black communities in the United States. As the previous speakers have pointed out, the African independence movements were a major inspiration for the Black liberation movement in the United States. But today we see the collapse in Africa of many nation states. We see that Africans are in the worst condition of any people in the world. And we see that many of our people have no kind of confidence in the governments that so-called rule these countries, which are in fact ruled by the IMF and the World Bank. And why is that? Amilcar Cabral made an assertion, the greatest leader of the 20th century, said, the liberation movement is an act of popular culture. He also said, You measure your chance for achieving liberation by the qualitative difference of your popular culture and that of the oppressor. And I would argue that culture is the primary motive force of revolution, contrary to the opinion of many political thinkers. And it has been our failure to master our people's popular culture that has put us in the crisis that we're in right now. The theme of this conference is revitalizing extended family communities through African-centered education. The family is the base of our popular culture. Africa, we thought, was engaged in an independence movement. And we thought we were engaged in a movement for liberation. But because very often we didn't go to the deep well of our culture and define the meaning of those terms, liberation and independence, we found ourselves in trick bags. In the case of Africa, the African leaders, many of whom were products of missionary education, including the best of our leaders, Kwame Nkrumah, and they were the best, had been a product of a missionary enterprise that some of them understood and some did not understand. When in the 19th century the British ended the slave trade, many of the Africans who had been enslaved through the British slave trade and the Western slave trade and through the connivance of their own traditional leaders were freed on the coast of Africa and then allowed to go into Sierra Leone, a nation that we see collapsing today, and into Liberia. Some came back from Brazil into Africa. The missionary enterprise in Africa concluded that they should oppose slavery because now the West had moved away from the slave trade and they were in an interim period where they would move to the stage of colonialism. And so for a period of time, the missionary enterprise was identified with anti-slavery. The Africans freed by these missionaries embraced Christianity. And this was a part of the British project. The British project was to get Africans to embrace Christianity, to then go into Africa and convert Africans to Christianity and form African churches. What happened is these Africans went back into their villages in Nigeria and Ghana and many other parts of Africa, preaching Christianity and preaching the need for the European nation state. What we need to understand is the independence movement of Africa missed a fundamental point. As great as it was in attempting to break away from European colonialism, the leaders of that movement were the Western-trained leaders who believed that freedom was based on taking the colonial state and blackenizing it, taking the colonial state and turning it over to black rule. Because these leaders had concluded that the traditional chiefs had collided with the imperialists, they were therefore backwards. Anything that was represented by our culture was called tribalism, and therefore the leaders of African independence, with very few exceptions, turned their back on their culture, though in many cases reached temporary alliances with traditional chiefs and formed the European nation state with a black coloring over it. It is incorrect to say that neo-colonialism followed this. The embracing of the European nation state with blacks managing it was neo-colonialism and is neo-colonialism today. So that if we look at the reality of Africa, for Africa to move to what Kwame Nkrumah referred to as a United States of Africa, a vision that came out of Africans in the diaspora, then we're going to have to go back and look at the best of these traditional systems, updating them to today, because Africans do not believe in these Western systems, and these Western systems have delivered Africa to the bottom of the heap in the world of poverty, while the IMF and World Bank rips off the wealth of Africa. So that's a view of Africa. That's not negating the struggles we carried out, but it's saying that we ignored something fundamental, and it was our rich culture. Between 1968 and now, something happened in our communities that a lot of us who are analyzing movements overlook. I had a student in a class 15 years ago, 18-year-old student, who asked a very profound question. She said, if our culture is so rich, why is it falling apart so fast? And I gave her an answer off the top of my head, and then I went home and I realized that that wasn't the answer. And then I was listening to James Baldwin with his brilliant self, speaking on what happened to us in the late 60s. He said in the late 60s, powerful external forces came to bear on the black community, the likes of which have never occurred before. And he says as a result, we were not in a position to resist it. And I was sitting in my study one night, humbly thinking about what this 18-year-old student questioned me about. And I asked the ancestors, I said, what happened to us in the late 60s? Here I am, an activist and a theoretician. And I didn't have the answer. I got humble. Only time the ancestors help you is when you get humble, when you realize you don't know. And suddenly I had this light. And this light said, a choice between two cultures. While we're engaging in these movements, one of the weaknesses of the black liberation movement, and I think we're stronger in this now, but we need to be stronger, is we did not have a sufficient appreciation of the popular culture of our people. I recall in a manuscript that's going to come out shortly, a brother has written a book on US organization. And in there, he makes the point that Maulana Karenga in the 60s made an error that the Nation of Islam made. Malcolm made, but Malcolm's experience went contrary to this. And it was the belief that the nationalist task was to bring culture to the people. That was Karenga's assumption. The Nation of Islam was based on that assumption, because the Nation of Islam believed we were deaf, dumb, and blind. They were correct up to a point that slavery had eroded our culture, but they were alienated from our popular culture. If you all remember, you weren't supposed to dance, you weren't supposed to listen to jazz, you weren't supposed to listen to blues. In fact, in part of this book, there's a passage where Karenga is converting Baraka, who has written a classic work on blues people, you understand, telling him the blues ain't African, ain't revolutionary, you know what I mean? Now, Karenga doesn't have that view anymore, but we made that mistake. Malcolm himself stated that we had lost our culture in slavery, and we were deaf, dumb, and blind. But Malcolm knew different because he also appreciated this popular culture. But the theory of the nation, because Malcolm was in transition, hadn't caught up with his experience. Now my point, and I want to end with this because this is a crisis we're facing now, and this is why this African-centered cultural renaissance has been so important. Between 1968 and now, the ancestors told me what happened to us was a choice between two cultures. While we were battling this cracker system, powerful forces came to bear on the black community. John Hope Franklin put it this way. He said, the black family proved resilient in the face of slavery and segregation and racism. Our parents knew how to teach us how to face the Klan, how to face white supremacy. You know what I mean? They taught us, blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice. They taught us, you couldn't be as good as white people, you had to be better. They taught us race consciousness, and a lot of us aren't teaching that anymore. But the thing is, when powerful external forces came to bear on us, and John Hope Franklin said in the form of hostile social policies, with hostile government regulation, the family proved less resilient. And the extended family community of African Americans, the lineage system of Africa, is the repository of the popular and classical culture. And you all know it is a serious mistake to say your people don't have culture, when in fact the only two popular cultures in this country are African American and Native American. And the only classical culture in this country is African American, so-called black classical culture, so-called jazz culture. Y'all hip to that? Y'all know that. Right. So the thing is, what Baldwin was saying, and what the light told me was that our people have been hit. Y'all here in Brooklyn, you know what's happened to Harlem. I come from the San Francisco Bay Area. What happened to the Fillmore, the Mole? You understand? Powerful forces came to bear on the black community. The Moynihan Report. It defined single-parent households where 25% of our parents, were single-parent mothers as deficient, as pathological. And what then happened is the government set up a series of hostile policies aimed at the family. And for the family to survive, literally, if you were poor, you had to involve yourself in a process of destroying the family, i.e. welfare, i.e. Head Start. A lot of us don't know. Head Start is based on the notion that blacks and poor people don't know how to raise their children. Permissive child rearing. Choice between two cultures. We've reached a point now where we have young mothers, that's not new, that don't know how to raise their children. because of powerful external forces that have come to bear on the black community. And we have young mothers who raise their children distinctly different from how our grandmothers raised their children. A choice between two cultures. Powerful external forces came to bear on the black community. Our people didn't fight for integration. Our people fought for equality and desegregation. But the House Negro leadership fought for integration. The plantation leadership fought for integration. And so when the opportunity to get a hot dog in a white restaurant, to sleep between white sheets in a white hotel came, we walked away from the black economy in the South. Am I telling the truth? See, many of us talk about the bombing that occurred in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Black Wall Street. There's a reparations issue right now, but I was giving Conrad an update because I was there a couple of months ago to speak. They took me through that community. They bombed the black community at the end of World War I. The Klan came in and burned up houses and took the people's property before they burned them up. But blacks had a Wall Street, a stronger economy than white people had. Everything we had was better because we came out of that race-first sense of excellence culture. Black people rebuilt Black Wall Street. But you know what? In the 60s, when integration came, we walked away from Black Wall Street. Black Wall Street is a ghost town right now. Because there was the remnant of the slave mentality that if it was white, it had to be better. Even though what blacks had was actually better than what whites had. You understand? Which is the truth. So a choice between two cultures. We have seen the intrusion in the black communities of the North, the redevelopment of so-called Negro removal. We've seen that in Harlem. We've seen it across the country. Blacks didn't walk away from their business economy or their black economy or their community in the North. It was bulldozed right underneath our feet with the connivance of the black church and the black elite. You understand? Because they got to keep their churches in the black community and their parishioners got moved out. But a choice between two cultures, some of us did not resist the destruction of black communities because we thought they were ghettos. And we thought we could live better somewhere else. Am I telling the truth? You hear me? We're the only people in America who have a divided view about ourselves and therefore about our communities. A choice between two cultures. We used to have extended family communities. Now we still have extended families, but fewer of them, but no longer extended family communities. We used to have elders who were highly respected. Now elders have to live hard to get respect. Am I telling the truth?
Yes, sir.
We used to have a thing where elders felt they were not only the parents of all children, but they were their children. They will lift them up. We now have the situation where elders are afraid of the children, and the children are angry with the elders for not having passed on their history and their culture, and not having given them the time to give them love. My point is this. Powerful external forces came to bear on our community in the form of counterintelligence program, redevelopment program, television, where we got to watch how white people socialize their own children. The Ford Foundation program, where they propped up a new black leadership. That was partially how they supported black mayors. Nothing wrong with black mayors and black communities if they come out of the black liberation movement. But these were black mayors, for the most part, that had no involvement in struggle whatsoever. So we have had a choice between two cultures. For the first time in our people's history, we have a generation gap. White people are the only ones that used to have a generation gap. We now got Negroes running around talking about what's rap. Our preachers are rapping. Your mamas are rapping. Black people are rappers. First people that, that gave birth to humanity were rappers. We rap and we gave birth to language. So what am I saying? I'm saying that we made a choice between two cultures. This was a subliminal choice. This wasn't a conscious choice in some cases. Some of our music changed. I hear Bloods now talking about they don't like the blues. Now you really have a choice between two cultures if you don't like the blues. Because the blues aren't blue, but the blues, you definitely are going through the blues. And as long as you go through the blues, you should like the blues. You understand? Because the blues is about how you get up when you're down. The blues about the black man not having the black woman. See, we better go back to the popular culture. We better draw from it. We better revitalize it. So in conclusion, across the African world, Africans are in trouble because we walked away from our culture. Africa needs to walk back into its culture to revitalize the African nation state. It will not move to Pan-Africanism until it's Africanism, until it's the best of our own system. African systems are consensus-based, not one-man-based. Ghana has been sold out to the multinationals, and Rawlings hasn't pocketed the money. But Rawlings didn't have a vision of how to take those traditional governance systems in the village and put it in parliament. In that parliament, a freak thing in Africa, dudes in black robes with white wigs, wigged out. Throw that stuff away. And the same thing here. We've got to go back to the blues, to the spirituals, to rhythm and blues, to black classical music. That's the heart of our popular culture. To the hip hop, to the best of our culture, to the best of our literary writers, the best of our political thinkers. And we've got to revitalize extended family communities. We can't end this battle around African-centered education, but we've got to take it to the block level. We got to go into the neighborhoods, and we've got to restore extended family communities so that elders are respected, so that young people have a future, so that schools in our community are controlled by us. And the final thing I want to say, one of the things that happened by the end of the 60s is King and Malcolm had reached a convergence. And what was beginning to happen in the 60s was synthesis. Rather than having the stream of integration in black nationalism, they were beginning to merge the best of both. And the one thing I'd say that both of them had agreed on, because I used to be a Garveyite, and I believed you had to get hacked and leave this country. I still have Garvey as my foundation, but as Garvey said of Booker T, if Booker T had come around in the 20s, he'd have to change his program. And I'd say of Garvey, if he came around now, he'd have to change his. Because the reality is, our task is to reach this conclusion and move it to a higher level that King and Malcolm reached, and that is, as Malcolm said, in a society that is crooked as a pretzel, we got to figure out how to straighten it out. And that means we have to bring Africa wherever we are. Our task is to Africanize this reality. So in the 21st century that we are in now, we will take a society that is upside down and bring it right side up by bringing the best of our African cultural, political, social, and economic agenda, merging it with the Native American, merging it with the best thought in this society to create something that's mo better. Hotel.
On over to Shaka for that enlightened analysis of the 60s to the current. His presentation focused in on what this conference is all about. The theme of our conferences is revitalization, the African-centered education. This is what it's all about. So if you read the book with Intellectual Warfare by Jacob Carruthers, he really traces that in the sense of talking about African-centered education. What is that all about? That's going back to Egypt. That's going back to where Aristotle and Plato got their philosophy from, in Timbuktu. Going back to the motherland, going back to the source. White folks have never yet given African credit for the start of civilization. I remember as a child, growing up in Alabama, not thinking that Egypt was connected to Africa. I never knew that I was part of this great civilization. If I had any idea that I was connected to the African-centered education, starting with Timbuktu, going back to Egypt and so forth, I would have had a whole different understanding of what education was supposed to be about. Believe me, I would have understood. And Jacobs, Carruthers, and Intellectual Warfare traces that when we talked about black studies, and when we were taking black studies to the next level, and when we were talking about African-centered education, the attack that they began to make on our brothers, like the brother that spoke last night, Dr. Jeffries, and so forth. And with this multiculturalism, creating it like, this schism between multiculturalism versus African-centered education. So this is why it's very important that we're having this conference and we're having this focus on revitalization, African-centered education. Our next speaker will be covering the period from 1990 to the present. Unfortunately, we do not have much time. We're running over, and we're trying to keep on a timeline here because we have a lot to cover. We are running short and going into our workshops. So our next speaker is Ansia B. She's a sister that I met when I first came to INVOLVE in the 80s. She was already here. Ansia has been in the struggle for the past 30 years. She's been on the front line. She's involved in the labor movement. Currently, she is the president of a Local 215. I bring to you Sister Ansia.
Sister bringing up the rear. I'll try to do the best I can. One, I want to share my appreciation and high respect for the brothers and sisters who kept this organization going, who had the vision to see that we still need a united front and are struggling against all odds to try to keep it afloat, like many of us are trying to do in other areas. Rather than to, since we don't have time, rather than to try to do a chronological piece on what was happening during the period of the 80s up to the present, what I want to focus on, since we have three key things going on, is what I'm kind of frustrated with, and I think that we need to all work together, both through this conference and when we leave the conference, in terms of trying to really get a handle on it, for us to be able to fundamentally change what needs to be changed in this country and also in the world. I think we need to, it's good for us to be very clear that we must understand where we came from. It's very, very important for us to understand and appreciate and love who we are as African people. And so our culture is very important. It's equally as important, though, to understand the places that we succeeded, the times that we succeeded in our struggle, but also the times that we failed. We also need to pay attention to who are we fighting against and dissect that to the utmost so that we understand that enemy that we're fighting against. Because what happens when we don't understand is that we get frustrated when our tactics don't work. What happens when we don't understand is that we get frustrated and demoralized when our organizations get blown up from inside or blown out from the forces from the outside, because we're not real clear on who our enemy is, and we're also not real clear all the time on what their agenda is. So I know our agenda is real clear. We want freedom, and we want justice, and we want sovereignty and control of our black nation here in this country, and we want black folks to be free throughout the whole world. We want our children to be able to have the best kind of education. We want to be able to live decently in homes that are not hovels, whether they're in the rural area or they're here in the city. We want to be able to flourish and develop to our highest point as individuals. We want our culture to flourish, and we want our institutions to flourish. But we cannot do that if we do not understand the agenda of the ruling class, the white ruling class in this country and throughout the world. Their agenda is to maximize the profit that they can make to any extent necessary. What's happening here, let's just go to New York City. I grew up in East Harlem. And when I go there, I'm almost in tears. One, looking at how they allowed us to think that we could survive in an inner city without really organizing to the point of really attacking and destroying their agenda of gentrification. The agenda that did not just start last week, last month, or the 80s, but an agenda that was in place and being fostered way back in the 40s. And also, if we look at every city, major city, that was a plan that was in place. When we rebelled against the ruling class in New York City and throughout the country, what did they allow to happen for 30 years and sometimes 40 years? They allowed us to live in a hovel. They kept the boarded up buildings. They denied our ability to be able to keep our communities intact and disperse some of us into housing shelters or someplace else, as well as with the tactics of some of our misleaders to tell us that we need to be running out to the suburbs to live with white folks. And what we did was we come up too late and too short and too little to deal with the agenda of the ruling class. And what I'm appealing to, I don't have all the answers. I don't even have half of the answers. But I'm appealing to us to really dissect the ruling class's agenda ahead of time. Not Johnny come lately and then trying to mobilize our forces to defend ourselves. I think we need to look at the agenda. When we supported the black mayors, for example, as the brothers were raising up beforehand, we thought that that was one method that we were gaining control. I even remember us talking about, you know, the Brooklyn Republic, like we were going to take over Brooklyn. We were going to take over the urban centers. What we were taking over was something that they had allowed to fall apart while they were moving industry and white folks out to the suburbs, and they said, this is what you got left over here. And we were taking, and they bankrupt most of the treasuries of those major cities. And then we put brothers and sisters in place to try to deal with that. Many of them were honorable people who really thought that they could try to correct that. Many of them were misleaders as well. What our failure was that we thought by putting them into office that they were going to miraculously be able to compete and change that whole agenda by themselves. And I'm raising it up because now we're talking about a whole big turnover of the New York City City Council. We have brothers and sisters who are going to be running for those positions. We cannot betray them by one thinking that they're going to get in those positions and be able to do it all by themselves. They're not going to be able to change the man and woman, white man and woman's agenda in this country all by themselves, or in this city all by themselves. I think what we need to do is to take the curtains and open them up and expose the powers that be very concretely by name, by industry, by location, by address that controls this country and this city. So when our brothers and sisters run, we need to all be clear on who are the forces. It ain't just the Mayor Giuliani. People talk about, are we getting rid of the mayor? Well, we didn't get rid of the white folks who voted for the mayor, okay? They're still here. And we didn't get rid of the political and economic power structures and individuals and corporations that helped further Mayor Koch and all the mayors that preceded him, as well as Giuliani, and quiet is kept, as well as my brother Dinkins, who did not fight the good fight and did not get rid of that power structure on which he just put himself on top of but did not destroy. We have to be real clear that if you run for an office, that you are running to administer somebody else's agenda. So we're not about that. We're about destroying that agenda and replacing it with an agenda that's going to allow our people to be everything that they deserve to be. And not just us, but Latinos, poor people, working people. We need to destroy the agenda that makes sisters lie that there are no brothers in the house so they can have money, so they can be able to pay their rent, so they can be able to get food. Because you know damn well that we got brothers in the house. Okay? But we can't say that at the welfare office. We can't say that when we're going to public housing. We can't say that when we're going to Section 8. We cannot say that. So we're made to lie, and then people write all kinds of books about the kind of family we have. That ain't the kind of family that we have. And we do have an extended family, because most of us couldn't survive. I know I couldn't as a single parent if I did not have that extended family. So we need to explode those myths, but more importantly, I'm just going to leave you with this. We need to we're in institutions now, we're in jobs, we have access to information. We need to put out very clearly who it is, who is in power, not just the man. Let's say the man's name. Let's say where the man works. Let's talk about the interlocking connections of the boards of directors of different corporations. We did that in D.C. when we were fighting against the utility companies, and we were able to expose and try to fight for better housing and a rent control bill. We were able to graphically take to our people, this is who's on the board of directors of the utility company that's trying to hype things up. They're also on the board that's doing gentrification, and they're also on Riggs Bank. And then we focused our energy on where those people lived. We went to their homes. We demonstrated in front of their social places. We need to expose them, and then we take our agenda and fight for that agenda. And I'll end there. Thank you, because I know we don't have much time.
Thank you. This is my friend. I want you to know that. We were in Massachusetts, and a white woman got up and said she wanted to run her for President of the United States. That's my friend, Encia. Thank you to the panelists, and I need to give them a hand. Yeah. I need the will of the body here. You know, when you've gotten so much, you want to be able to maybe interact for a moment with the panelists. Do we have time for that? No? No time? Okay. All right. No time. She'll be able to assist you. Also, the Lift Every Voice and Sing CDs are here. The 100th anniversary celebration, Lift Every Voice and Sing, they are $15. What's coming to a convention if you don't leave with the t-shirt? Hello. Okay, see, my most popular, I think one of the most frequently asked questions at a convention, where are the restrooms? Okay, they are behind the registration table. I know in your program, one more thing, where's lunch? But now that's the question. Okay, talking about lunch, and don't tell people where the lunch is at. Okay, the lunch will actually be set up for you in the lobby. It's buffet style, and you will be able to sit down and eat in the cafe just a little bit past the double doors, and you'll be able to sit and eat your lunch there. Okay, it's we apologize we don't have both things in one room, but this should work. Who's here with us? You know, this morning, Sister Annette Robinson came through, and we will have people coming through. I feel inspired. I feel fired up. I really do. I feel fired up this morning. Amen. Yeah, come on. I mean, you're sitting there like, oh, us really having this convention here in New York, because this is really meaningful, and that we are getting together to talk about some things. That is meaningful. You know, so I said for whatever, we're going down, but as the convention goes on, he can drop back in at any point in time, and as time permits, we welcome you to just greet us. And this is Assemblyman Roger Green. As an announcement, but workshop rooms are all on the second floor. The second floor that's in your packet, they are still good for the workshop rooms. Thank you.
All right, everybody. I can truly say it here today that this is one of the best presentations on the analysis of the movement that I've heard in a very long time. And I just want to acknowledge all of the presenters, because you touched on a lot of areas that some of us think we're experts like me. I was enlightened. I'm glad you played the voice of Fannie Lou Hamer that brought some chills in my heart. I'm glad you brought up the name of Ella Baker, who's one of the baddest sisters. 1 hour part of the workshops, I would make a suggestion that the workshop preliminarily try to get themselves organized. Introduce yourself, talk about generally the topic. So, finally, you know, NBUF is involved in a lot of things. And one of the things we're involved in right now is an extension of our genocide campaign. It's our participation to help organize the patient in the United Nations-sponsored World Conference on Racism. And we're working to spread the word to get our people in our communities at the grassroots level involved in understanding the importance and significance of this movement. And we have one of the best posters designed by Brother Omawale Clay that has come out of the movement in a very long time. You can see we're selling this for $2. This is a promotion so that we can get the word out so the United States government and the Negro who represent the United States government and the white folks who are aligned with the Negro who represent the United States government will get jammed when we get to South Africa in the summer of 2000, because our push and our, what I say? 2001. Thank you, Ms. Porter. You know, I ain't getting old. But anyway, our fight at this conference, one of the major resolutions that we're playing slave trade is a crime against humanity. And if we can get that out there and follow what Malcolm was telling us and directing us to do to expose the contradictions of the United States government and white supremacy and the Western power. We think that we will posters, we want in-buck chapters to take some home. I don't know if we'll let you get them on credit, because I know how I've worked. I've done that with y'all before and it ain't worked. But anyway, but you can at least purchase a poster for $2. So I guess it's time to eat lunch, and thank you.
It's not time.
He's ready to eat.